This video was brought to you by our backers on Patreon like Robin K. Thanks, Robin. If you sign up now, you can get an exclusive TLDR lanyard absolutely free, and that offer only lasts until the end of this month, so this is your last chance to find out more at the end of the video. You might have heard that Cuba is currently going through a bit of a crisis, with protests and unrest erupting across the country. Now, the fundamental reason behind the current protests is that Cuba doesn't have enough foreign currency reserves, and Cuba needs foreign currency reserves for two reasons: imports and debt servicing. Cuba is very import dependent. It imports about 70% of its food and over half of its fuel and machines. To buy this stuff, Cuba needs foreign currencies like the dollar, because the international markets don't really accept the peso, Cuba's domestic currency. Cuba also has a lot of international debt. According to latest data from 2017, Cuba owes about $17.8 billion in foreign debt, but this number has almost definitely risen since then. Cuba is also already late on a bunch of these debt payments, and last year signed an agreement with the Paris Club to forgive $8.5 billion worth of overdue debt, with $2.6 billion left to pay over the next 18 years. Anyway, the point is that Cuba needs foreign currency reserves to service and pay off these debts, because again, no one wants pesos. Unfortunately for the Cubans though, Cuba's foreign currency reserves are lower than ever, and that's basically for three reasons: COVID, a weak export year, and the US embargo. Let's start with COVID. A lot of Cuba's dollar reserves come from tourists spending their currencies in Cuba, and tourism accounts for about 13% of their GDP. Unsurprisingly, COVID has crippled this industry. In 2019, for example, some 4.2 million tourists visited Cuba, compared to only 1 million in 2020. Cuba has also had a pretty weak export year, and exports are a great source of foreign currency. Sugar, which makes up about 13% of total exports, saw the worst harvest in over 100 years thanks to a drought. Medicines and the export of medical services, which make up about 10%, also had a bad year, in part because doctors had to return to Cuba to fight the coronavirus domestically. The final reason, though, is the US embargo. Since basically the end of the 1960s, the US has had a trade embargo on Cuba, the longest in modern history. Essentially, this means that US companies and individuals can't do any trade with Cuba. And in 1996, this was expanded to include foreign companies in the Helms-Burton Act, which said that any foreign company that trades with Cuba is prohibited from doing business in the US. The embargo was somewhat relaxed under Obama, who in 2014 announced that he planned on re-establishing diplomatic relations with Cuba. But these relaxations were immediately reversed by Trump, and so far, Biden hasn't made any changes. The embargo and the Helms-Burton Act specifically really discourage foreign investment into Cuba, which makes it even harder for Cuba to stock up on foreign currency reserves. It's also worth noting that since 1992, the UN has passed a resolution every year demanding the end of the embargo, with the US and Israel being the only two nations that consistently vote against the resolutions. You get the point though. Cuba was lacking foreign currency reserves. Now, to try and solve this, the Cuban government decided to devalue their currency, the peso. If the peso is cheaper, then it should also make exports cheaper for foreign buyers, which in turn should give the country more foreign currency reserves. Now, until 2021, Cuba had a really weird dual currency system. There were Cuban pesos, known as CUPs, and Cuban convertible pesos, known as CUCs. The CUCs were introduced in 2004 as an attempt to slow down the dollarization of the Cuban currency. Essentially, by 2004, Cubans had started using the dollar as an unofficial second currency because it was more stable than the peso. To try and defend their monetary sovereignty and stop this from happening, the government introduced CUCs, which can be exchanged for dollars at a 1-to-1 rate. Anyway, we're not going to go into the complicated economics of dual currencies, because trust us, it's really complicated. But essentially, the way the government decided to devalue their currency was by unifying these two currencies. On the 10th of December 2020, the Cuban government announced that the CUCs would gradually be withdrawn from circulation, beginning on the 1st of January 2021, leaving the CUP as the only currency in circulation. The CUP would then be pegged at $1 for 24 CUP, and Cubans would only have until June 2021 to trade in their CUCs for CUPs. Now, this is pretty confusing, because on one hand, that looks like a 95% devaluation. A CUC has gone from 1 to 1 with the dollar to 24 to 1. But on the other hand, it also looks like no change at all, because the CUP is still the same as it always was. In practice, it's actually somewhere in between, and academic analysis found that the merging of the CUC and CUP would amount to a 6-fold devaluation, which basically means the peso would be devalued by about 80%. While a devaluation might be good for exports, it's not good for imports, because with a devalued currency, imports become more expensive, which means serious inflation for Cuban consumers. Pavel Vidal, a former Cuban central bank economist, estimates that Cuba will see inflation of somewhere between 500 and 900% in 2021. To mitigate this, the Cuban government announced that public sector wages and pensions would be increased by 400%, but this apparently still hasn't been enough, especially for the quarter or so of Cubans employed in the private sector. As a result, Cubans are still struggling for food, in part because of the global uptick in food prices, and many have resorted to buying it on the black market in US dollars. This is all against the backdrop of COVID-induced recession, with the Cuban economy contracting by 11% in 2020, and expecting a further decline this year. Essentially, rapid inflation, a lack of foreign currency reserves, and general economic woes have meant that Cubans have suffered from food and medical shortages, and even electricity blackouts. And this is the proximate cause of the protests we mentioned at the start. And these protests started on July 11th, in the outskirts of Havana, before spreading to the rest of Cuba. The Cuban military then cracked down on the protests after a few days, and as of today, some 500 Cubans are still unaccounted for, having been detained or arrested during the protests. In the aftermath of the protest, Cuba's foreign affairs minister blamed US Twitter bots, and the president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, blamed what he's called American imperialism. Now, while neither of these analyses are quite correct, they've both got a point. On the American imperialism thing, it's true that the US embargo on Cuba has exacerbated their economic woes, but it's not the only reason that Cuba's economy is in trouble. On the Twitter bots thing, while it's probably not entirely true to say the protests were caused by Twitter bots, social media has definitely enabled the protests. Historically, the Cuban government has put strict controls on the media, coming 171st out of 180 countries in the 2020 Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. However, this control has become more difficult with the rise of social media, especially since Cuba introduced 3G service in 2019. This has made a real difference too, because in 2005, only about 10% of Cubans had access to the internet. Today, it's about 60%. The Cuban government were clearly aware of this, which is why when the protests first kicked off, they shut down the internet for a couple of hours, but had to turn it on after a while, in part because they needed the internet for exports and foreign currency reserves. In fact, it was estimated by the UCA that the shutdown alone cost them $13 million. This is something we've seen all around the world too. It's the same thing that happened with protests in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Hong Kong, and even in Nigeria. So what happens now? Well, the Cuban government has quite successfully cracked down on the protests, but a permanent solution to the unrest will require an improvement in Cuban living standards, and both outside analysts and the government's insiders think that this will require economic reform. Now, we don't want to get into a whole debate about the merits of socialism, but even the Cuban government admitted in 2011 that it would need to move away from its current form of socialism towards a more market-oriented economy if it wanted economic prosperity going forward. The government has been slow to implement the reforms promised back in 2011, but the protests will most likely accelerate this transition. It's worth noting, though, that Venezuela, Cuba's closest socialist ally, has suffered similar economic problems. In 2013, after food and medicine shortages, in thanks part to weak oil exports, the Venezuelan government devalued their currency by 30%, which led to hyperinflation, with Venezuela experiencing 247% inflation in 2016, 863% in 2017, and 130,000% in 2018. Then in 2019, the IMF estimated that inflation that year had reached 10 million%. It's worth noting that, like Cuba, Venezuela is also under a US embargo. With the apparent collapse of both Cuba and Venezuela, it looks like we may be nearing the end of socialism in South America. We're not saying this is a good or a bad thing, it's just that the two big socialist countries in the region are currently experiencing very similar, very serious problems. Problems that could spark further changes in government strategy and potentially moves away from their socialist and communist past. What do you think though? What will happen next in Cuba? And what, if anything, should the international community be doing at this point? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As I said at the start of this video, we're running a Patreon promotion whereby every patron paying more than $5 a month can get an absolutely free, never for sale lanyard. To claim yours, sign up to the TLDR Patreon and click the link to the store. Signing up not only snags you a lanyard, but gets you a bunch of other perks, including early access to videos, exclusive live events, merch discounts, and more. Find out what you can get and sign up by clicking the link in the description.